And the next item of business is a statement by Jenny Ruth on protecting children from harm. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement. Therefore, there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary up to 10 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, protecting children from harm is of the utmost importance to this Government. Those who have suffered as victims of child sexual abuse have been let down by a system which should have protected them. Discussion of these topics, whether that be in the national press or indeed in this chamber, should be sensitive to that trauma. All parties should rightly treat this matter with the appropriate care and seriousness which it demands. I welcome that opposition leaders, spokespeople and relevant committee members will have the opportunity to meet with Professor Alexis Jay and Police Scotland for a full briefing on their work on the 14th of January. As I previously set out to Parliament, the Scottish Government has not ruled out the establishment of an inquiry into group-based child abuse and exploitation. The experts on the National Strategic Group have been clear, however, that there is limited evidence at the current time on the nature and on the extent of this issue in Scotland. It is therefore imperative that this evidence base is established at pace to clarify next steps and to lessen prolonged suffering for the victims of these crimes. And this evidence base matters to survivors, as one told me last week. The current narrative is moving faster than the evidence base, and that policy commentary and public positioning must remain anchored in verified evidence rather than momentum or rhetoric. When language runs ahead of evidence, the consequences are borne not by commentators, but by survivors, through misrepresentation, loss of trust and further harm. Presiding Officer, the National Review has been established in part to scrutinise the effectiveness of local responses. The review will be led by 4 statutory inspectorates, which are importantly independent of government and the organisations which they scrutinise. And crucially, these agencies have powers to compel public authorities to provide information which they request. Those powers will be critical to the success of the review. Public agencies will not be able to refuse to cooperate, and the inspectorates will help obtain the evidence needed to inform future decisions and investigations. This approach will be underpinned by Professor Alexis Jay's expert advice on its design and at key stages of the process, drawing on her unrivalled experience in this area. This work will, of course, also operate within Scotland's established constitutional arrangements, including the independent role of the Lord Advocate in directing the system of criminal investigation and prosecution. The Cabinet Secretary for Justice and I are clear that this work must be undertaken at pace, with ministers, the National Strategic Group and Parliament receiving regular and appropriate updates. The review will be conducted in 3 parts, with reports provided iteratively to ministers. In the first part, the inspectorates will scrutinise data and evidence from all local authorities about the risk and the threat of group-based abuse and exploitation. This rigorous work will be detailed, ensuring that all local authorities' responses are scrutinised. And I can assure members that if any harm or risk is identified during this review, that this will be escalated immediately through the appropriate channels, including to Police Scotland, as required. Action will be taken and need not wait for the review to conclude or for an inquiry. I know that members like me will have welcomed the news last week that the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry confirmed that it will be able to hear and act upon evidence relating to grooming and group-based child sexual abuse as part of its Phase 10 hearings, where this falls within the inquiry's terms of reference. I want to be clear with Parliament today that any person who considers that they may have been groomed and sexually exploited as a result while in residential care before the 17th of December 2014 has a right to contact the inquiry. The National Review, Police Scotland's ongoing work and the advice of the National Strategic Group, chaired by Professor Jay, will gather evidence, help us to take action where it is needed now and inform advice to ministers on whether a national inquiry on group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation is required. Ministers expect to be able to update Parliament more fully on this work by the end of February. Presiding Officer, we must also ensure that survivors' experience is at the heart of our considerations. Their voices must be heard and they must be listened to. It is critical that we take the right approach and involve survivors in a trauma-informed way with appropriate safeguards in place. I do not underestimate how distressing it is for survivors to share their experiences of abuse. I commend the courage of those who have already spoken out, whether publicly or privately with government. Be in no doubt, your voices matter. I have today written to the cross-party group on adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, along with the Justice Secretary, to request that we attend a meeting in the new year to hear directly from a wide range of survivors which the CPG represents. This approach of engagement with the CPG mirrors that taken by the National Strategic Group, which will further consider more strategic approaches to engagement with victims at its next meeting in January. And it is vital that the views and the experiences of survivors inform the work that we are taking forward. And I want to assure survivors today on a significant concern to them about the retention of records and information relating to their experience and which is pertinent to this work. I know that this is a matter which has caused and continues to cause significant distress. The Director-General for Justice and Education has therefore written today to key agencies and organisations asking them to review their document retention policies to ensure the retention of all documents that may be relevant to the National Review. This is additional, of course, to the instruction to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, which it issued when it began its work on keeping records and information which it would wish to review and consider. Presiding Officer, it is shocking and sickening that children and young people in our society continue to be sexually abused, often by members of their own family, as well as increasingly through online exploitation. Therefore, we must also invest in initiatives which address such harm and help children and young people to recover. To date, the Government has provided £20 million for the Bairnshoes programme to enhance holistic, child-centred support for children who have been harmed. This is in addition to funding for third sector organisations working to prevent and protect children from sexual abuse and exploitation. Today, I am announcing a further £220,000 of funding to be deployed immediately during this financial year. This will enable the UK Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse to undertake pilots in 2 Scottish local authorities in 2026 and 2027. These pilots will provide access to experts and resources to help build the skills and confidence of frontline practitioners in identifying and also responding to child sexual abuse cases. It will also help support funding for the Lucy Faithfull Foundation to strengthen its work in Scotland with young people and families impacted by online sexual offending. And it will support free access to online harm training from the Children and Young People Centre for Justice and the Lucy Faithfull Foundation. And additional funding will also be provided to enhance Police Scotland's digital forensics capability and ability to act on online harm. The funding to Police Scotland will importantly build upon existing capabilities of the National Child Abuse Investigation Unit. That unit provides a specialist approach to tackling child abuse and exploitation. It is focused on complex cases involving multiple victims or perpetrators and organised networks and conducts around 700 investigations per year. Presiding Officer, just as we must investigate and address what has happened in the recent past, so must we ensure that we are doing all we can in the here and now. We must work to protect children and young people from harm and, importantly, to identify improvements required in current approaches. We published revised National Child Protection Guidance in 2021 to support the development of evidence-based responses. This guidance makes clear what everyone working with children must do to protect children from harm, including reporting to social work and the police when a child is experiencing or at risk of abuse or exploitation. We are also rolling out national training for local services and professionals on interagency referral discussions. These discussions are fundamental to our system of child protection in Scotland. They bring together the police, social work, health and wider partners to share information, assess risk and agree a safety plan. In recognition of the increasing complexity of child sexual abuse, we established the National Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Strategic Group last year, and from January the group will be chaired independently by Professor Alexis Jay. I want to pay tribute to the determination today and drive of its recent co-chair, Iona Colvin, Scotland's Chief Social Work Advisor, who is retiring this week following a career dedicated to protecting Scotland's children and young people from harm, abuse and neglect. To build on the work of the strategic group, I want us to go further. The mandatory reporting of child abuse has been the subject of recent discussions in this chamber. Many professionals in Scotland already have a duty to report child abuse. I know this from my own time in schools. However, the National Strategic Group has been actively considering the case for a broader statutory requirement for mandatory reporting, And I want to be clear with Parliament today, mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse is a position supported in principle by Scottish ministers. A task and finish group is being established under the guidance of the National Strategic Group to consider potential models. Presiding Officer, this Government is determined to take action to establish the potential extent and scale of child sexual exploitation. That includes conducting an independent national review to assess the prevalence of this type of abuse, the effectiveness of local systems, and to identify any risks or evidence that require early action. I have today provided further detail on our approach to the national review. I have set out how we will involve survivors to ensure their voice is heard. I have announced additional funding to help professionals better protect children and prevent harm. And I have indicated our support for the development of mandatory reporting options for Scotland. But this must be a shared endeavour. All MSPs, all political parties, have a role to play in protecting Scotland's children and young people from harm. I therefore invite MSPs from across the Chamber to support the work underway and, crucially, to offer their own input and ideas by engaging meaningfully. Our children and young people deserve nothing less.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 20 minutes, after which we will need to move on to the next item of business. I encourage members who haven't already done so, but who wish to ask a question, to press the request to speak buttons. I call first Russell Finlay.
Thank you. And I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement. The SNP government didn't want to talk about grooming gangs. They said they were not a problem in Scotland. Well, these gangs or paedophile rings are a problem in Scotland. And every survivor who I've spoken to has no trust in this government in relation to group-based child sexual abuse and exploitation. The Justice Secretary has been sidelined because she misrepresented an expert, then denied doing so, and has still not corrected the record. Her responses today raise even more questions about her conduct and her integrity. This morning I met Kimberly Hutchison, a survivor of child sexual exploitation, which started when she was 10 years old. And she told me that this government is, and I quote, behaving in the same way as those who exploited and trafficked us. She and others, they use words like chaotic, shambles, dishonest, disgraceful. We remain clear, and survivors remain clear, there must be an independent inquiry. And if this government has any hope whatsoever of rebuilding trust, it must start listening to survivors, not creating another talking shop. So will ministers heed their calls to include survivors on the existing National Strategic Group and the new Task and Finish Group? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Finlay for his question and his interest in this issue. He raises particularly an individual by the name of Kimberly, and I just want to put on the record my own intention to meet with survivors. Like Mr Finlay, I have met with Taylor's mum, who I think Mr Finlay has engaged with directly yesterday, and I'd be very keen to offer a meeting to Kimberly. I set out some of the steps that I will be taking as Cabinet Secretary alongside the Justice Secretary to engage directly with the CPG and survivors, but I do think it's important that this work is undertaken in a trauma-informed way, which I set out in my statement. Alexis Jay, in her evidence to committee this morning, talked at length about the importance of listening to survivor voice. She also talked importantly about not thinking about survivors as a monolithic group, I think a point that was made by Mr Greer yesterday. I read in my statement to Parliament today a quote from a survivor who's been in touch with my office, and I just want to come back to some of that, Presiding Officer, because the survivor who contacted me said, when language runs ahead of evidence, the consequences are borne not by commentators, not by survivors, they are borne rather by survivors through misrepresentation, loss of trust and further harm. The evidence base is something that we have not yet established. Alexis Jay has been very clear on that. The requirements behind the review set out the ways in which the evidence base will be established, and I will come back to February to provide a fuller update in that regard, as I set out to Parliament in my statement.
Pauline McNeill.
Every day the Government's approach to grooming gangs inquiry is more chaotic, a cobbled-together response and a structure that is still confusing. Last week, the 4 inspectorates were asked by the press. We're still awaiting guidance, and His Majesty's Care Inspectorate said to the press that they still not had been contacted by the Government. So, as the Cabinet Secretary, is it not time to agree with Scottish Labour here? This review requires clear leadership And the obvious person to lead that is Professor Alexis Jay herself. She is the expert to lead and direct this review. Further to that, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she is satisfied that victims have full confidence in what she has announced today as the way forward? I asked the Government why they did not seem to have any prior understanding of the seriousness of organised child exploitation. Have they really treated it with the seriousness it deserves? I am still awaiting an answer for the 46 children on the Police Scotland list who we still do not know what has happened to that list. I was promised an answer last week. Can the Government convince me today that I will get an answer to that question?
I thank Ms McNeill for her question and her ongoing interest in these matters. I do want to come to the point in relation to the Healthcare Inspectorate in particular, one of the 4 independent inspectorates that will be leading on the National Review. And I want to put on the record, as of course I have checked this with my officials, that on the 20th of November the first version of the signed National Review proposal was received from the Care Inspectorate, from Healthcare Improvement Scotland, from His Majesty's Inspectorate of the Constabulary and from Education Scotland, and it was shared with Professor Alexis Jay for expert advice. On the 28th of November, feedback from Professor Jay on the national proposal was shared with all 4 inspectorate partners. So I'm not necessarily sure I follow the argument from Healthcare Improvement Scotland, but just for assurance, my officials are engaged directly with them and they have been appraised of that. In relation to the point that Polly McNeill has made in relation to the National Review, I go back to the points I made in the Chamber 2 weeks ago now. These independent inspectorates have responsibilities and statutory powers that don't rest with ministers. They are able to interrogate information from local authorities, for example, and they will be able to come back with some evidence and advice and guidance. But throughout that process, Alexis Jay will be informing the methodology they use. She will be providing expertise to that. And she spoke to some of these matters in front of the Education Committee only this morning. The final point Ms McNeill raised relates to victim engagement. Again, this is a matter that the strategic group are taking forward, as I understand it, at their next meeting in January. I've also committed to engaging with the CPG along with Ms Constance, but along with other survivors as well. I've been very open to that and have already undertaken the start of some of that work. But it is important that we have an effective strategy. Alexis Jay talked about the need for this to be undertaken in a sensitive manner. So we will take advice from the strategic group when it meets in January in relation to how we engage, but we will also continue our work with the CPG, noting their expertise in this area.
Thank you. As you might expect, there is considerable interest in asking questions. I'll try to get everybody in, but the questions will need to be fairly brief. I now call Rona Mackay to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to hear more detail about the National Review and that phases will be concurrent. I don't underestimate the work that will be involved by the inspectorates in this important work. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that it's now time to allow the professionals involved the space to undertake their vital contribution and for MSPs to focus on how that will support the work to protect children?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I thank Ms Mackay for her question. I do think it is important to emphasise that Police Scotland is already undertaking work to review child sexual abuse and exploitation cases, and the National Review, which is being led by the inspectorates, will be starting rapidly. That National Review is not just about gathering information and providing the scrutiny that I've spoken to, but it's also about experienced professionals identifying and recommending improvements that are going to protect our children. And findings from the review will be responded to as they come to light, and updates will be provided to Parliament on how the review supports the protection of Scotland's children. And as I intimated in my statement, Presiding Officer, I intend to return to Parliament in February to provide further updates to that end.
Liam Kerr to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The absence of reliable data was exactly the issue that I raised in my amendment in September, so I recognise the imperative of gathering that. But given the time already lost, can the Cabinet Secretary tell me clearly when this review will conclude, what the key milestones and dates are, and crucially, what findings or thresholds would be required to trigger a full independent inquiry?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Liam Kerr for his interest in this matter. To reassure him, this point was discussed at Education Committee this morning with my ministerial colleagues and officials, and in relation to his amendment, one of the officials from the Education team was keen to point to the existence of other commissioners that we have in an education space, for example the Children's Commissioner. I know Mr Kerr will be au fait with this from his time in education. So I'm mindful of that, but the substantive point he makes in relation to data is an important one. And I go back to the quote I read out from a survivor who contacted me last week. We require to establish the evidence base that we do not yet have. That may lead to the establishment of an inquiry. I do not want to prejudge the outcome of that review, but I will come back to Parliament in February to set out more detail to that end.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, President Officer. I was pleased that the Cabinet Secretaries have offered to meet with the cross-party group and adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse, and I can confirm that as chair of that group, I've received the letter and we look forward to this happening in the new year. One of the areas the group has focused on in recent months is that of mandatory reporting, and I welcome what the Cabinet Secretary has said today in her statement on this. Can she say a bit more about the considerations of the National Strategic Group that she referred to, and when she thinks that they may draw conclusions on the potential models that she talked about?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I said, we are considering the case for a broader statutory requirement on mandatory reporting of child abuse, and we are engaging very closely with stakeholders on this, and that includes the cross-party group on adult survivors of childhood abuse, as well as Police Scotland, Social Work and Child Protection Committee Scotland and others on this issue. The Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation National Strategic Group has discussed this issue at its last 2 meetings, and it's also agreed that more work is required to consider mandatory reporting in relation to the depth provided. So it agreed to establish a task and finish group to develop options for a Scottish mandatory reporting model. That group is currently being set up, and I again put on record today Minister's support in principle for mandatory reporting. The task finish group, though, that I think Professor Jay alluded to in her response to committee this morning, will take forward work to consider and develop options for Scotland and report into the Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation National Strategic Group, which of course will be under Alexis Jay's leadership.
Paul O'Kane, to be followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. My sense coming out of the committee evidence sessions this morning is that the Government don't have a grip on many of these issues. I think it's clear, given the reporting earlier in the week, that there's been confusion within review bodies. We have multiple ministers taking parts of responsibility. There were not clear terms of reference. I note, however, what the Cabinet Secretary has now said on that and trying to get more clarity on that. But I did push the Cabinet Secretary for Justice this morning on the importance of victims in this and their concerns about the landscape being too cluttered, about not being clear on who is responsible, and ultimately them not having confidence in the process. So my question would be, where should victims go if they have a story to share? Victims who would not be covered by the pre-2014 point that Ms Goruth made.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Paul O'Kane for his question. I was taken by some of the commentary from Alexis Jay at the evidence session this morning, who talked, of course, in her evidence about the lack of evidence in this space, but also about low levels of reporting. And we need to be mindful that much of the crime that we are talking about today is hidden by nature of the type of abuse, which often involves power differentials, for example, and it's hidden in plain sight. So we need to be mindful that under-reporting, that low reporting, it requires to be interrogated, which is why I set out in Parliament 2 weeks ago the approach we are taking with the independent inspectorates. In relation to victims themselves, of course, the work of the strategic group is relevant in this space, and as Alexis Jay, I think, provided an update to committee on, that will be taken forward more by broader work by the strategic group in January. I've also set out my intention, along with the Justice Secretary, to engage with the CPG, but further to that, we'll take advice from the strategic group on ministerial engagement with survivors. So I will come back to Parliament in February to say more about this, but I do think it is important that this is undertaken in a trauma-informed manner. And though I know Paul O'Kane's question was not about the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, it is worthwhile putting on record again that, as was intimated on Monday of last week, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry is able to look at instances that may constitute grooming or group child-based sexual abuse, should it be within the terms of reference of the inquiry. And I would encourage those who think they may have been affected to contact the inquiry directly, because it is there for good reason.
Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Presiding Officer, I draw Chamber's attention to my register of interest. I'm a trustee of Break the Silence, a charity offering therapy to people affected by childhood sexual trauma. I agree that victim survivors should be listened to and heard. Can I have some assurance from the Cabinet Secretary that victims, survivors and their families will have access to trauma-informed resources and support, both before, during and after contributing their views and stories, please?
Secretary.
I thank Ruth Maguire for her question. I think she raises a hugely important point. Many years ago, when I was on the Justice Committee, I remember undertaking a visit to Oslo to look at the Bairnshuis model in relation to trauma-informed approaches and how that works to support child victims, in particular, of sexual abuse. We have to ensure that survivors' experience is at the heart of our considerations. The Justice Secretary and my engagement with the CPG that I have spoken to is part of that work, as is the focus of the National Strategic Group. But I did listen with interest to what Professor Jay said on this to committee this morning. It's hugely important that we acknowledge that there's not one single community of survivors, so we need to take on board her advice and look at how we can engage widely. For example, she spoke about children in particular and ways in which we can engage with different groups of survivors and appropriate means of doing so, for example, via trauma-informed approaches such as the Bairns-Hoos model.
Thank you, Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, and I refer members to my register of interests. I worked for a rape crisis centre before being elected. The Government has indicated its support in principle for mandatory reporting of child sexual abuse. Given concerns raised by survivors' organisations about unintended consequences, such as children being deterred from seeking help or trust being undermined in support services, will the Cabinet Secretary consider a full human rights and child rights impact assessment before bringing forward proposals, and to ensuring that any model adopted strengthens rather than weakens early intervention and survivor trust?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Maggie Chapman for her question. I think it's fair to say there are a range of different views on this issue, but Minister's views certainly have been informed by the points that Liam Kerr was making in relation to data and under-reporting. So we are mindful of the factors that Maggie Chapman has put forward. I am broadly supportive of what she has set out in relation to human rights considerations, but we also need to be mindful that we do not have a reliable data set at the current time which is required to decide upon whether or not we are going to have further inquiries. So I think mandatory reporting is a key part of our response as a government in that regard, but I do take on board the issues that Maggie Chapman has raised in that respect today.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Elena Whittam.
But the problem with that answer is that it may result in a lower level of reporting because young people might just shut down. They might fear the consequences. They might fear reporting. And therefore the enormity of it might result in us getting lower levels of data than we otherwise would be. Can I just urge her to express caution and carefully move forward, working with the professionals to make sure we get this right, because we've got to get it right.
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely concur with the position that Mr Rennie has set out. There will be a reticence, and he spoke, I think, there to the views of young people and a fear around about reporting. But the reality is, I think, as I said to Maggie Chapman, we have very low numbers at the current time in terms of our recording of these crimes, and it is important that we build that evidence base. Mandatory reporting could be part of building a better evidence base, but the way in which we engage in that work is really important. So I do take on board the points Mr Rennie has made in relation to the expertise, and ministers will very much be guided by the advice and guidance that we receive from the National Strategic Group, which of course is chaired by Alexis Jay.
Elena Whittam, to be followed by Sharon Dowie.
In my work prior to this place, I supported far too many young women who were trafficked into prostitution following grooming whilst in care. Accountability is key to preventing such harm and will shine a bright light where it is needed. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to set out the steps that will be taken now to ensure that care-experienced young people, many living with complex and multiple trauma, are not failed by fragmented systems, and that they are listened to and believed, and that education, social work and all partner agencies are effectively coordinated and held accountable for keeping them safe in the first place?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Elena Whittam for her question. She mentioned care-experienced young people, so I should put on the record my register of interest, because my wife is a member of the Promise Oversight Group. But I do think it's important that we have a strategic approach to these issues. She set out a number of different agencies with responsibilities. Those agencies and partners, of course, have representation on the National Strategic Group, and that is the key group that will give advice and guidance to ministers in relation to the next step that will inform whether or not we establish further inquiries. But the evidence base and the threshold for that requires to be met via the 4 independent inspectorates, and of course that's the necessary work that I set out to Parliament 2 weeks ago.
Sharon Dowie, to be followed by Claire Hawkey.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged the importance of preserving records and information relevant to this review, yet instructions to review and retain documents are only being issued today. Given concerns about the loss of evidence in historic abuse cases that have been raised repeatedly by victims, experts and this Parliament, why were these safeguards not put in place at the very outset of this process, and what assurance can she give that relevant records have not already been lost during this delay?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Ms Lloyd for her question. As I understand it, the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry put in place a number of requirements in that regard many years ago now. We have supplemented today and strengthened the approach via communication from the Director-General for Education and Justice in that regard. That has come as a direct result of engagement with victims and listening to their experiences around about records retention. I know the distress and trauma that records being destroyed has caused to victims, and it is imperative that that behaviour does not happen in any of our organisations that are involved in protecting children and young people. So the approach that's been set out today, I think, further strengthens that approach, but it is one that's already been taken via the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry.
Claire Hawkey, to be followed by Katie Clark.
I welcome the clarification from the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry that Phase 10 will include grooming gangs where it falls within their terms of reference. How does their independent work inform the Scottish Government's approach to improving child protection measures?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the work of the inquiry is already providing a very detailed picture of failings across a wide range of care settings. The Government has welcomed each of the inquiry's interim findings, and we've emphasised that they vindicate the harrowing testimony of survivors, and we will continue to listen carefully to the evidence being given to survivors, and we are fully participating in the inquiry process. But the inquiry's final report will make recommendations to improve on regulation, policy and practice. And the Scottish Government is absolutely committed to learning lessons from the inquiry's work and also to reporting to responding to improving the protection of children in care.
Katie Clark, to be followed by John Mason.
Survivors have lost confidence, so can the Cabinet Secretary outline what kind of further inquiry might take place? For example, is it a full public inquiry which is being considered, its remit and timescale, and who is doing the work on that? And can she clarify whether the terms of reference of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry include abuse of children who were in care when the abuse took place, where the abuse took place outside of the care setting and by perpetrators not employed in the care sector or connected to it?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Katie Clark for her question. I set out to Parliament 2 weeks ago now the approach we are taking in relation to the 4 inspectorates, establishing their responsibilities, coming back to provide the evidence base to the National Strategic Group, who will then provide advice to ministers. And of course, it would be remiss of me today to prejudge the outcome of those investigations. Alexis Jay today at the Education Committee, and I think throughout the course of the past few weeks, has been very clear that the evidence base does not yet exist to substantiate the need for further inquiries. However, we require the evidence base to be built. So that is what the 4 inspectorates have been tasked with. They are undertaking that work at pace. On her final question in relation to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, I think that is the approach that Lady Smith set out in relation to our understanding of the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry and the terms of reference, but I would like to write to the member specifically on that detail to give her clarity on that final point.
Thank you. We have a little additional time this afternoon, so I'm going to call the final 2 speakers that want to ask a question. First, John Mason, to be followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you. We have had public inquiries that have gone on for years and years and years, and I would question whether that really serves the victims very well. Could the Cabinet Secretary make a commitment that if there is to be a public inquiry further down the line, that it would be time limited, as I believe is happening? It's 3 years in the UK.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Mr Mason for his question. I think this is a line of question he pursued at the Education Committee this morning, and I think it's also been debated by another committee in Parliament in relation to the costs, Finance Committee in relation to the costs associated with public inquiries. I'm not going to rule that out today because I think it would not be appropriate for me to do so. The evidence base, as I stated in my response to Katie Clark, has not yet been gathered, so it would not be appropriate for me to rule that out today. And I'm not going to make a general comment in relation to time limits either today, Presiding Officer, because we do not yet have that evidence base. But when we do have that evidence base, of course, these are matters that the Strategic Group will provide advice and guidance to ministers on.
And Miles Briggs.
Deputy Presiding Officer, will the Cabinet Secretary agree to report back to Parliament on any destruction and loss of evidence and records when she's made aware of that? And Russell Finlay asked if survivors would be included in the Government's existing strategic group and new task and finish group, and I don't think she answered that question.
Cabinet Secretary.
On both points, supportive. In relation to reporting back to the Scottish Parliament on records retention, yes, I'm happy to do that if we are provided with evidence from the inspectorates of any evidence of that. And as I stated in my statement, I will come back in February to provide a fuller update to that end. In relation to the inclusion of victims, I apologise to Mr Finlay. I meant to catch that earlier on. This is something that the strategic group are actively looking at. They will be discussing ways in which to engage with victims at their next meeting in January, and I'd be more than happy to write to the member or to provide that update in February to provide reassurance that victims' voices are going to be at the heart of how this review is conducted.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes this item of business. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.